say thank you all for coming to the first of what will be many debate nights here at UNLV. I'd like to take this opportunity to ask you all to please silence your cell phones at this time. Thank you. Tonight's topic is going to be, is it reasonable to believe? We'll do this for about an hour, 45 minutes. This is going to be an informal debate in that it'll be very conversational. We'll have each side has prepared questions that they would like to ask to the other side, and there will be a direct response after each question. Each question will do for about 9 minutes before we move on to the next question. Depending on how it goes, we may continue a few minutes longer for one, if the conversation seems to be particularly fruitful. But we'll do this for about an hour and 45, and then at the end, we'll do this for about 90 minutes, and then at the end of the event, we'll have an opportunity for those of you in the audience who would like to ask questions for each of our groups. So if you have a question of your own, if you think of it during the event, write it down or remember it, and you'll get a chance to ask it at the end of the event. I'd like to introduce our speakers for this evening. On the side of belief in God, we have Jordan Fishel. He's a student of philosophy and an instructor of Christian doctrine and systematic theology. And we have Professor Shandon Guthrie. He's a visiting lecturer of philosophy here at UNLV. He's an affiliate faculty professor of philosophy at Regis University, where he teaches philosophy of religion. He's also co-leader of the Christian College Ministry Converge. On the side of atheism, we have Professor Bill Ramsey. He's an associate professor of philosophy here at UNLV. Before coming to UNLV 3 years ago, he taught at Notre Dame for 18 years, where he became known as something of a village atheist. His area of specialization is philosophy of mind and cognitive science, and he just recently published a book with Cambridge Press on mental processes. Sitting next to him is Mike Gobaud. He's a senior student of philosophy here at UNLV, specializing in ethics and philosophy of religion. He will graduate in 2 weeks, and then he will be attending law school in the fall. He is also the scholarship chair of the Phi Delta Theta fraternity, and he is the public events officer for the Rebel Secular Student Society. Okay, we mentioned the format that we're going to do tonight. We flipped a coin at the beginning, and the atheist will be asking the first question of the evening. Go ahead.
All right. Okay. This is one of the most common questions and common arguments against belief in God historically. And most of you have probably thought about it. That's why we decided to ask it first. Basically, the Western theistic conception of God is that there exists an omniscient, omnipotent, all-loving being, God. And we also notice in the world there's an immense amount of suffering. There's two kinds of suffering. There's natural suffering, or natural evil that produces suffering, and there's moral evil, which produces suffering. And just to be clear, by evil we mean suffering. So the question is, why would an all-loving God allow this? He's all-knowing, so he would know this is going on. Things like 9/11, the Holocaust, a fawn burning to death in a forest fire, and suffering for days before finally dying. Things like that, natural suffering or natural evil causing suffering. Why would a God who knows about this not prevent it? He's all-powerful, so he could. All-loving, so he would want to. So this poses a huge problem for the Western theistic conception of God.
First of all, thank you for the invitation to participate in tonight's important debate. And I'd like to, well, thank you, Drew. I'm honored to be sharing the platform with Dr. Bill Ramsey and with Michael Gobaud, who is a bright mind and a force to be reckoned with. Also, just a little bit about the context about the side that we're representing. Even though the caption is belief in God, we've been asked to specifically represent more of a partisan God, that is the Christian conception. So when Michael was saying the Western conception, you might translate Christian, which is, typically when these controversies arise, we tend to think with respect to Christian theology in particular. Now, with respect to the question, why is there so much evil in the world? Of course, it's undeniable. You all have final exams coming up, so you're painfully aware of the problem. But beyond that, we have things like the Holocaust, 9/11, earthquakes in Haiti, and so forth. So the question is, how then does the Christian sort of reconcile the reality that evil exists and that God exists? Now, philosophers historically have tried to assess this question with respect to the incompatibility thesis, which is to say that just God's existing is somehow universally incompatible with the existence of evil. But this question is more toned back. It's more or less, why is there so much evil or meaningless evil? And let me just give a couple of launching pads of conversation here. First of all, I think that the problem, which is more or less an intellectual problem that we're dealing with tonight, the psychological adversity that evil ensues, of course, is obvious. But with respect to the intellectual or the philosophical issue, let me just say that I think that in order to cast God's existence into doubt, which I think it initially does, fails to properly assume what the purpose or the meaning of life actually is. It's not that God has so created us as, say, a habitat for, as his human pets, that the purpose of life is to live the life of Joel Osteen, your best life now. Rather, the purpose of life, according to Christianity and Christian theology, is that you should have knowledge and communion with God. Now, if we only take into account happiness, well, yes, that seems to call God's existence into question. But what about with respect to fostering a relationship with him? And this just isn't just pure speculation. The Baker Atlas of Christian History documents that those places in the world where suffering is immense are those places where basically Christianity is very much on the rise. Second of all, if you consider other Christian doctrines, I think this minimizes the impact the problem of evil has for the Christian theist, such as the doctrine of human depravity and the fall, such as that God's purpose does spill over into the afterlife, and such as that knowledge of God and communion with him will eventually overshadow the pains and the sufferings that we have. Yes, we're here in this earth, if we're lucky, 80 plus years, but once we're in the banquet hall of God, and trillions of years have transpired, these mere 80 years will be but a blip on the scale. And then finally, I think that the evidence for God's existence counterbalances the evidence that evil may pose against the thesis.
Okay, Bill, can you hear me? To build off on what Shannon just presented here, it is also necessary to define what we mean by meaningless or unnecessary suffering. How do we provide a basis to compare that? How do we even define that? Is there even really any meaning we can draw to that? Building off on the purpose and design God has for human life, well, we can think of a world where there's less suffering or minimal suffering, but is such a world conceivable to attain to God's purposes and designs? How we could even come up to a comparison like that, I do not know unless you gentlemen could present something, but we could also take it very simply that the amount of evil being rather than merely something God is doing spitefully,